launching a data-driven approach in China. Now, Darren is currently head of global digital media of iClick Interactive Asia Limited, based out of Singapore. He has held roles at a number of prominent ad tech and media companies spanning 3 markets, including UK, Australia, and now Singapore. Darren began his digital career at Yahoo in London before transferring to Australia to work for Yahoo 7. He also spent 3 years agency side at Zenith Optimedia and Icon Communications, working for clients such as Qantas, Citibank, News International, and Vodafone. So Darren, over to you.
Everyone hear me all right? Cool. So as suggested, I'm going to talk to you today about how to tackle digital China. So as mentioned, a bit of background about me. Worked in many different markets, and you're probably thinking, why is there a white guy here talking to you about China? Well, the truth is, we're a Chinese company. For the tech heads in here, we're a DSP, but we also have a market intelligence tool. So what we do, we enable brands, advertisers to understand the market and then execute digital media campaigns through our platform. So before I go into the whole spiel about China and why it's different and how to tackle that, I think just realigning on, no matter what market you're in, making a successful data-driven approach or campaign in any market, is winning the moments that matter, finding the right audience with the right message at the right time. This is a global ethos, and in order to do that, you have to understand the landscape, you have to understand the consumer, and you have to understand, bespoke habits and consumer habits. So from today's session, there are a few things that I want you guys to walk away with. I really want you to understand China, why it's different, how it's different, the consumer, the trends. I want you to feel comfortable with that. It is a completely different landscape, and I'll go into all that later on. And I want you to be able to feel confident that this is something that isn't as daunting as you think. It's just different. So to kind of set the scene, I'll go through the different challenges, that we have in China. And this is something that is particularly prevalent to my role in international markets, because I'm talking to brands, agencies, trading desks in many different markets outside China, from Australia through to Thailand, through to London in the UK. So I get quite a lot of questions around this, and kind of what we do is actually not so much, we're a DSP, we can do this, that, and that. It's more, this is China. So it's a real education piece. And then I'll go into talking around the digital landscape, and then I'll talk about the actual Chinese consumer, their habits and why it's different. And then I'll actually take you through a few of our own examples and case studies of how we actually use data to run successful campaigns. And then finally, hopefully round it all up. So the challenges. If I'm a marketer in a market outside of China, and I'm looking to run a campaign in China, there are kind of 3 big key challenges that kind of I come up against. A lot of people now in the digital world, they use programmatic as a way of buying media. Programmatic, as I'm sure everybody knows, it's a way of simplifying that buying process, and it's a kind of a platform which allows you to buy many different channels. The problem is, you talk to Western tech companies, Western DSPs, they come up with, there's no real Chinese audience data. So, if I'm here in Singapore, how can I really understand that audience? Not just before the campaign, and then also post-campaign for the analysis as well. The second thing is, how do I get access to Chinese inventory? MediaMath, DBM, all these guys really struggle with China, and I'll talk about that later on as well. Premium inventory is really hard to get hold of unless you're within the Great Firewall. And then the third one, which may not just be applicable to China, is around that transparency and control. This is something that I've heard brought up many times over the last day, and I'm sure it'll be brought up again tomorrow as well. And then, in true China fashion, there is another element as well, the government. So the Chinese government, as I'm sure everybody knows here, is very protective over content that gets shown. Now, while I'm standing here, I'm sure if someone has access to Google or any of the other kind of major buying platforms, they could probably log on and launch a campaign, and away it goes. China works very differently. It works in a pre-approval process. So every single piece of creative has to get approved by publishers, ad exchanges first. And the reason behind this is the government is very protective over content that gets shown. And the publishers are actually liable for any of this content, not the advertiser. So if I'm Mr. Tencent and I'm showing an ad that's anti-government messaging, sex, drugs, rock and roll, all the fun stuff, it's actually Mr. Tencent that will get reprimanded and fined by the government, not the advertiser. So as a result, there's a couple of key things that are very different to Western markets. So third-party ad serving is non-existent because you relinquish control over the content that gets shown. That's one of the big challenges from a kind of techie point of view that we come across. And so, the Great Firewall is very protective over everything that happens within that Great Firewall. At the moment, there's the 19th National Congress of Communist Party. It's a bit of a mouthful. And as a result, the censorship has been incredibly tense over the past sort of month or so. And Tencent and a few others have actually been fined by the government, especially across social media for content that's been shown. So that, again, is something that you kind of have to think about when executing in China. So hopefully that gives you a bit of understanding of some of those challenges. The next thing I'm going to talk about is actually giving you a broad understanding of the landscape. So no surprise here. China is the world's biggest country. I think India's catching up. But the probably key takeout here is, there's almost 1.4 billion people, and around half of them are internet users. Every single one of them is a mobile user, and this is something that I'm going to keep coming up. And again, a lot of these are also social media users as well. So that 1.4 billion versus 750 million, that's a huge growth opportunity. You look at markets like the US, UK, and kind of quite mature markets, the growth curve has happened. So it's a very saturated market, and there's not much of a growth curve. China, it's still exponential. So these numbers are from January 2017, and the report was published in June 2017. So there are 20 million new internet users in those 6 months. I worked it out, that's 1 a second. So by the end of this session, there'll be another 2,700 internet users in China. It's a phenomenal, phenomenal growth rate. So I'm sure everybody's read press around China, the key players, and Baidu, Alibaba, and Tencent are kind of the big three heroes, or BAT as they're commonly known as. Again, one of the challenges of China is they all work very separately to each other. There's no IAB, there's no Comscore, there's no sort of police of the internet. So they each have all their own different ways of doing business. Interestingly as well, whilst Baidu is renowned for search, and Alibaba is renowned for, obviously, its e-coms, and Tencent is kind of the mobile and social king with WeChat, they actually have a consumer-facing product for everything, whether it's search, whether it's social, whether it's video portals, whether it's app stores, and they're diversifying into all sorts of different areas as well. Baidu are making cars, Alibaba, and I'll talk about this later on, they have Hollywood picture houses, and Tencent as well, again, Hollywood picture houses and all sorts of fingers in all sorts of pies. And they're also expanding outside as well. So Alibaba buying Lazada and all these different acquisitions that are going on as they try and spread their tentacles. But this is what we read about. But in truth, it's not actually just about those three. So Google and Facebook dominate globally. In the US, they account for 80% of the digital dollar. I think this, again, has been something that's been dotted around in various different talks today. But in China, the BAT actually only account for 60 cents to the digital dollar. So what this means is, it's not as clear-cut as Frugal or whatever you want to call them. It's a much more fragmented marketplace. So there's a lot more going on than you probably pick up and read about in the press. So who are those other platforms? Here's an example of some of those key companies. These range from Meitu, which is kind of like an Instagram-y type place, to a few of the others that are video streaming, which is super popular in China. But my favorite is Taotiao, sorry about my pronunciation, which actually translates as latest headlines. This is an ever-increasingly popular app whereby it uses machine learning to understand your needs for what headlines you want to read. And it basically aggregates the media and pulls it all in, so you're getting a tailored news media kind of experience through one app. These are all independently owned. There's no BAT involved with any of these. And they're starting to really ramp up, and that 40% is quite likely to maybe go higher. So we've kind of now understand the challenges, we understand the landscape, so now we need to understand the consumer. So getting that message to the right person at the right time. So who is the consumer and what are their habits? A bit of a snapshot into the digital lives of the Chinese consumer. A few, again, you can see the mobile theme coming strong here. Online shoppers is massive. Does everybody know about Singles Day? It's coming up in 3 days' time. So Alibaba own this shopping day in China. It's called 11/11 Singles Day. Last year, I think it was around just under $20 billion US done in 24 hours. This year, I think it's going to expand to about $25 billion. It totally eclipses Black Friday, Cyber Monday, and it's an online shopping day where across Tmall and Taobao, which are the big shopping portals owned by Alibaba, there's just ridiculous amounts of sales. People are actually now logging onto Tmall and Taobao, loading up their shopping carts so that as soon as it gets to midnight, they just go on and buy the discounts. So we're seeing a ton of advertisers looking to ramp up for that now. This is interestingly as well around that. I was talking about how it's expanding globally. Quite a high percentage of their revenue actually comes from overseas Tmall and Taobao stores. So, for example, people buying Australian brands or US brands or UK brands from Australia and those other markets as well. And another kind of takeout from this as well is the online duration per netizen. This is actually a higher online duration versus other markets such as the US, and I'll talk about the reasons why for that later on. But there's one particular segment in China that is hugely dominant and hugely popular, the Chinese millennial. So these account for 22% of the Chinese population. They're a result of the single-child policy, and you've got this millennial that is getting spoiled by two sets of grandparents, by their parents. They have a ton of cash to spend. They go on holiday 3 or 4 times a year. They fly business class, 4-star hotels. They're a very, very privileged and spoiled generation. The impact that they're having on the global economy has led to Goldman Sachs describing them as the single most important demographic in the world. And the reason behind that is, they'll go on holiday to, say, London, for example, and they'll walk down Bond Street, they'll walk into Cartier, and they'll buy a couple of watches and just walk out, as though it's nothing. And there's a couple of times a year, actually, which are really important for this. So we've just had Golden Week, which is the first week in October, which is a week-long public holiday in China. And we see mass migration from China going to lots of overseas markets. So that's one. Actually, my parents were telling me a story in England where they live probably about half an hour away from a luxury retail outlet. And they didn't realize about this whole Golden Week thing. And they decided to get in the car and drive down to this place called Bicester Village. I don't know if there's any English people in the room that might have heard of it. And anyway, they said they literally just drove in and just drove out because it was absolutely stacked. They saw queues in every single shop. It was absolute pandemonium. And the other kind of key outbound period is Chinese New Year, which is normally around February time every year. And again, week-long public holiday. The difference between the two is Chinese New Year is, I guess, more like Christmas. So it's more about spending time with family, friends, gifting. It's a whole red packet phenomenon. Whereas Golden Week, the October Spring Festival, is actually more around vacations. So that's where we see destinations like the Maldives, Bali, Thailand are a lot more popular at this time, whereas the other time people are going to see family and friends. So Australia, Southeast Asia, US are generally more popular at that time. And going back to kind of like one of the key themes of this, 50% of the millennials check their phones every 15 minutes. That's quite a lot. And we need to understand their actual behaviors as well. So I'm actually a searchy at heart. I kind of started in search, so I'm a bit of a geek. So I firmly believe that search is indicative of consumer behavior, right? If searches go up, it means a brand is popular for whether it's a good reason or a bad reason, but it's obviously something that's important. And click-through rate and sales as well. So we looked at the average click-through rates of Baidu, which is the big search engine of China, versus Google. And Baidu has a much higher click-through rate than Google. So what does this mean? It means that the Chinese consumers like to be advertised to. They perceive it as a sign of quality. A great example of this is WeChat, which is, I'm sure everybody knows about WeChat. It's the hero app of China. They actually only released advertising in 2015. And BMW was one of the first advertisers. So BMW is super popular in China. It's their biggest market. And they actually hid the advert from a lot of people, to the point where consumers were actually complaining to Tencent and WeChat that they weren't perceived to be in the right class to get that advert. There's all these amazing quotes like, morally, my soul was destroyed, and all this type of stuff. It's crazy. But this really does tell you quite a big picture of kind of how that generation want to be advertised to, and they want to be perceived with this like luxury brand. There was a talk earlier actually on China. I don't know if anyone was here, but he was also saying a similar thing. Like externally, they want to be perceived to be consuming these luxury brands. It's a status thing. So yeah, just going back again, just reinforcing the fact that mobile is really king in China. 96% of people are accessing the internet through their phones. It's hugely ingrained into their life. So much so that in China, they have walkways built for people to use their mobile phones as they're walking down the street. Interestingly, it's actually on the outside next to the roads. Being a little bit cynical with the single child policy being kind of a bit more lax, it could be the government actually looking to do some damage control over the population, but I'm not sure. But yeah, this a picture paints 1,000 words, and I think this kind of really hammers home that message around mobile being king in China. But what are people doing on their mobile? Video is super, super important to this as well. According to eMarketer, 3 out of every 4 internet users in China are active viewers of digital video. Why is this? China's a real commuter culture. People will often commute, an hour to and an hour from work. So what do you do when you're on your phone? You're on your commute, you sit there and you faff around on your phone. And people like to consume content. So online video in China is really important, and it's a huge part of the digital landscape. There's no YouTube, there's no Hulu, all these kind of like outside China or Western brands that we kind of use every day. User-generated content in China is a big no-no. So what that means is we have these super video channels, iQIYI, Youku Tudou, Lei TV, Sohu, and it's super popular between them to get rights to certain things, whether it's sporting events, NBA, Premier League, all that type of stuff, through to Western dramas, films, and all that type of thing. And it's so super popular between them, but the problem is the government limits the amount of non-Chinese content that's coming in. So in true kind of China fashion, Tencent and Alibaba have broken into Hollywood. Kong was a film I recently saw, great soundtrack, and Alibaba as well, Mission Impossible that's just coming out. So what they're doing, they're investing in Hollywood, and it's kind of like a bit of a loophole, so that doesn't necessarily get classed as Western content because it's got Chinese influence in it. That is the power behind and the affluence behind these super companies. They want to do something and they just throw money at it, and it kind of just happens. But going back to the mobile scheme, right? A lot of this is happening on their mobiles because of this commuting. The telcos in China are really aware of this trend, and the big 3 telcos actually offer really competitive data packages to try and entice people onto their networks because they know that people want to consume this content whilst they're on the go. Interestingly as well, tablets or phablets, the kind of like the middle size, are super popular in China, but it's not necessarily, it's pretty much not an iPhone. iPhones are very expensive. It's locally produced companies like Lenovo, Huawei, and these guys that are producing amazing smartphones, but it's a fraction of the cost. So again, that's also super competitive. But the growth is in these video channels and also their mobile apps as well, as you can see from this slide. So to kind of like tie this all together, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about some of the examples of what we've done to help illustrate the power of data. The first example I'm actually going to show you guys is actually absolutely nothing to do with media at all or brands or anything. It's actually Game of Thrones. So is everybody a Game of Thrones fan, or is it just me that's not? No? OK, good. So no matter what country you're in, Game of Thrones is really, really popular. And the idea of us using this as an example is to highlight the power of the data and the insights that you can get. I do have some brand examples afterwards, so just bear with me. So we compared Game of Thrones versus House of Cards, which I do watch, Walking Dead, and Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. And we kind of, using various different inputs, basically keyword-based, we actually discovered that the addressable market for American TV series was around 136 million. And then you can see that Game of Thrones is actually probably just about the most popular. House of Cards and Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. just behind, and Walking Dead was just a fraction just behind that. So what can we pull out from this? We can actually pull out the male versus female split, and we can actually pull this out for every single one of those different inputs. And we can analyze this trend over time as well. So looking at all the different inputs and how certain things happen at certain times can then influence those different changes. And then for Game of Thrones, the products are actually the characters. So then we get an actual understanding of the different characters, right? So we look at Jon Snow and Daenerys. We can actually look at that and see, if I'm a fan of Jon Snow, I'm actually also, no surprises, I'm a big fan of arts and entertainment, but then jobs and education, culture, health, wellness, consulting and services. And then, so you really get quite a big understanding of that audience, the profile, the products. But I think, I'll show you an actual brand example now where it might actually make a bit more sense. So I mentioned BMW earlier being quite a key brand in China. They came to us with the launch of their BMW 7 Series. And they really wanted to understand who their competitor was. So we analyzed them versus the Audi, versus the Volkswagen Phaeton, and then the S-Class. Does everybody know about the Volkswagen Phaeton? It's discontinued now, but it was actually a product, a model that was launched by Volkswagen that is obviously Volkswagen on the outside, but on the inside, it's pretty much a Rolls-Royce. China was its most popular market, and the idea behind it is, you can roll around in luxury, but not bring too much attention to yourself. But no surprises that the S-Class was, what they thought was their biggest competitor. In truth, through looking at the data, it wasn't even a saloon car. It was actually the luxury SUV market, which is where their biggest competition was. So from this, we really understood, who their actual competitor was, who's stealing their market share, and how they can then, devise a marketing plan to actually take that share away from the Volkswagen, from the SUV. So just confirming. Another example is Suntory. So Suntory is actually a Japanese beer. They came to us and said, we want to reach that beer market. So looking back to the Game of Thrones example, we can analyze the product and see where the other interests are. So by using the same theory, we actually understood that, obviously there's an interest in beer, so we can use keywords that are pretty obvious. But then we actually understood that, people that like beer are also, and this is what the data told us, they're doing job applications. Not quite sure what that tells us. But they're also interested in online games and animation, sports, no surprises there, and social things as well. So things like leisure, gathering, party, karaoke, food. So kind of like really closely related things. So what that means is, we have a beer audience of 1.6, 1.7 million people, but actually the addressable market is almost 12 million. So we're extending that reach to find more of the target market for Suntory. So, in terms of performance, really strong click-through rate, over 2.5. You can see the actual...
三得利纯生为精彩拼搏。
There you go. So you can see the actual click-through rate. We had a huge over delivery in terms of targets. And as I said, reaching an audience of 12 million versus what they might have originally thought was around, just under 2 million. So, conclusion, one of the most important things around China is understanding the data, understanding and using that data to really get behind the consumer. Who is that consumer? What are their habits? What are their other interests? And how can we reach them? Secondly, embracing the landscape. It's not just the BAT. It's way more than just that. So you've got to think that there's a lot more out there than just what you might originally think or what you might read about. And thirdly, work with a local provider. Work with someone that understands the landscape. Like you look at this, and it is 99% Chinese companies, right? So work with someone that understands that landscape, that can navigate it for you. It's not that tricky. It's just different. And so I think the main theme behind all of those three different elements is the importance of localization. So don't just take something from Singapore or Australia or the UK or wherever and just plonk it in China. It won't work. You have to localize it as much as possible. So by doing this, we will help you find the right audience with the right message at the right time. And I think that's it.
I'll throw straight out to the floor. Has anyone got any questions? Not at the moment, but as I was listening to what you were saying, I couldn't help but wonder about privacy. I just think we are entering. I wanted to know how the Chinese deal with their data, whether they will become more protectionist over it, how brands should cope with that.
Yeah, so I think it's a very different market, and I think with China that consumers, they want to be advertised to, so they're a little bit easier about relinquishing that data for purposes. And I think as well, people in China think that by not being protective over the data, the government can then use that to also be very protective and wary over everything that goes on within China. So it's a very different marketplace in terms of data protection and all that type of stuff versus other markets.
And you also talked about millennials in your presentation.
Yes.
Having the biggest spend there. But what about, I mean, that's where we are at the moment. But eventually companies are going to want to think, what next? Who next? How are we going to not flatline our growth, make it grow even more? Which means you will have to consider the other generations, the X, the Ys, and the baby boomers.
Yeah, I think the next phase of that would be the baby boomers. And they're probably the follow-on stage from the millennials that have kind of gone through that stage and then into the baby boomers. So they will probably be, we do see quite a lot of interest in that market as well. And interestingly as well, we see a lot of interest from Western brands who are looking to target Chinese baby boomers who want to buy things like baby milk, but it will be brands like Bayer in Australia, Blackmores, because it's really popular because there's a stigma in China that if you buy from Australia, it's actual quality. It's not fake goods. It's not contraband or anything like that, and it's guaranteed to be the right stuff. There is a trend in Australia, the Daigous, which means shoppers. And these guys are selling tons and tons of stuff from chemists on online stores in Australia to people in China. It's a huge, huge economy, making millions every year.
So how much more expensive are online marketing campaigns in China compared to elsewhere in the region?
I guess I think that the key thing to think about with China versus, say Singapore, for example, there's 5.5, 6 million people in Singapore. There's 700 million online users, a population of 1.4 billion in China. So the commitment has to be relevant to that market. You can't go into China with a 2K or a 3K campaign. To make an impact, you have to make an impact.
And also, we are seeing a lot of online retailers clicks to bricks, so they're venturing into the back into the high street.
Yep.
Some of the heavyweights are looking at this strategy to capture the audiences. Do you think that trend will continue with online markets wanting to have that physical presence?
In China, online shopping is a very comfortable place. Whilst I think it's more the other way around. So stores and brands will have stores, but they will probably sell more online. I think there's some stories around, like the Burberry store in China, is not profit making. But they know that people go in there and they find the models they want and they do the whole browsing and that thing. And then when they go on holiday, they'll actually buy it abroad, which is also why we see this huge proportion of luxury spend coming from China globally.
Are there any other questions from the floor before we wrap for the day? Before we thank Darren again for his time, this room will now close. It's been a fun-packed day. Do check your Mumbrella 360 app to see what the agenda is for tomorrow. And don't forget the Mumbrella Asia Awards 2017 Gala Dinner. If you have already bought your tickets, you will need your name badges to get in. So don't forget those this evening. But please put your hands together for Darren. Thank you very much indeed.